She counted the wood a second time and got the same number. This was January 4th. She had been in Iowa Territory for 3 years, and she had learned in 3 years that the numbers did not change when you counted them again, but that you counted them again anyway, because counting again was the thing you did when the first number was not the number you needed it to be. She needed 12. She had 7. She stood in the cold of the woodshed, which was not heated and which was therefore a reliable thermometer for how cold the January was intending to be. And she put her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the 7 remaining cord for a long time without seeing a way to make 7 into 12. Joseph had cut 12 cord in October. That had been the plan. 12 cord for the winter, the same as the previous 2 winters, the same as the first winter in Iowa when they had arrived in the autumn of 1861 with their trunks and their tools and the specific determination of people who had crossed an ocean for a particular life and who intended to have it. Joseph had cut 9 cord by October 18th. On October 19th, Joseph had developed the fever. He had developed it the way people developed fevers in Iowa Territory in the autumn, suddenly and completely, with the particular efficiency of a fever that has made up its mind. She had managed it for 10 days in the way she knew how to manage fevers, the compresses and the broth and the sitting up through the nights, with the specific patience of a woman who had nursed her mother in Moravia and her sister before that, and who believed, as she had always believed, that patience and attention were the instruments and the outcome was what the outcome was. She had sat beside him through the nights and pressed the compresses and managed the temperature and told him, in the Moravian Czech of their village, that the fever would break. She told him this because she believed it and because she had seen fevers break before, and because Joseph was 43 and strong and had been healthy every day since he had landed in Baltimore in 1861 and had not once been ill in Iowa. Not in 3 winters, not in the cold and the mud and the hard first year before the claim started returning what they had put in. She told him the fever would break on the 7th day, on the 8th, on the 9th. On the 10th day, the fever broke the other way. Joseph Blazka died on October 29th in the cabin he had built himself on the Iowa claim he had filed himself and worked himself, in the bed he had made from ash timber cut from the creek drainage, with his wife beside him and the morning light coming through the south window and the woodpile outside at 9 cord. He had been going to cut 3 more cord in November. She cut the remaining 3 herself, working the crosscut saw alone, which was possible but slow, because the crosscut saw was built for 2 people, and she was one person who had never used a crosscut saw alone before November, and who learned to use it alone by November because there was no other option. She braced the near end, with her knee on the downstroke as Joseph had shown her once, demonstrating the technique he hoped she would never need, the backup for a day when he was unavailable, which they had both understood as illness or injury, and neither had understood as death. She had cut 3 cord in 6 weeks of November, and she had believed this was adequate. She had been wrong. She had not been wrong about the arithmetic. 12 cord was what the previous winters had required, and 12 cord was what she had. She had been wrong about the fireplace, or rather, she had not thought carefully enough about the fireplace, which was the original fireplace that had been in the claim cabin when they arrived, a standard American frontier fireplace of adequate construction and ordinary design that burned wood efficiently by the measure the fireplace used, which was the measure of how quickly the wood became heat and how much of that heat left through the chimney and how much stayed in the room. By that measure, the fireplace was adequate. By her measure, standing in the woodshed on January 4th with 7 cord and 12 weeks of winter remaining, the fireplace was a machine that turned her woodpile into smoke at a rate she could no longer afford. She counted 7 cord a 3rd time. Then she went inside and sat in the hickory chair and looked at the fireplace and thought. She had been a potter's daughter in Moravia, in a village called Biskupki, in the hills east of Brno, and her father had worked a kiln, and the kiln had been the education of her childhood in the way that useful things were the education of children who grew up around them. She had grown up understanding that fire was not heat, that fire was the instrument you used to produce heat, and that the relationship between the fire and the heat it produced was not direct and was not simple, and was the thing you controlled if you understood it, and the thing that controlled you if you didn't. Her father's kiln was always the kiln. She thought about the kiln. The kiln was a stone structure. The stone chosen for density, the stone that did not crack when the temperature swung from cold to hot and back to cold, because firing cycles were exactly that. Hot and cold, hot and cold. The firing and the cooling repeated hundreds of times over the life of the kiln. The stone absorbed the fire's heat during the firing and gave it back slowly during the cooling, and the pottery inside the kiln benefited from both. It fired in the heat, and it cooled slowly rather than cracking, because the stone did not cool quickly, and the pottery cooled at the rate the stone allowed. She had understood this as a child, in a way she had not needed to think about consciously since childhood, because in Moravia, the houses had heaters that used this principle, and the principle was just the way things were. The way the cold was just the cold, and the fire was just the fire, and the stone was the thing between them. In Iowa territory, the fireplace had no stone between the fire and the room. There was a stone back wall to the firebox, yes, but it was thin, perhaps 4 inches of local limestone, and it had no mass to speak of. No accumulation of heat-holding material, no reservoir that could absorb what the fire offered during the burning and return it during the hours between fires. The fire burned, and the room warmed, and the fire died, and the room cooled, and at 3 in the morning the room was cold, and she woke cold and fed the fire again, and this was the system. The system used 12 cord. She looked at the fireplace. She looked at the field stones along the south wall, the field stones that Joseph had collected for the spring garden project and that were stacked there in a neat row, dark grey Iowa limestone, dense, the good stone from the creek bed a quarter-mile east. He had collected them in September when the collecting was pleasant, the way he did things he intended to do properly, gathering the material before the season closed. There were perhaps 300 pounds of fieldstone along the south wall. She pressed her hand to one of them. Cold. Of course cold. They had been sitting against an unheated wall in Iowa January. But she pressed harder and held her hand and felt beneath the surface cold, the specific density of a stone. That would not be cold for long if you put heat into it, and would not be warm for long if the heat had nowhere to go, and would be warm for a very long time if the heat had somewhere to stay. She held her hand on the stone. She thought about the kiln. She went to get the notebook. The notebook was the record she had kept since arriving in Iowa. The account of the claim and the crops and the costs and the calculations. The record of a woman who had managed the household arithmetic while Joseph managed the physical work. The 2 parts of a functioning farm that needed to be present in the same life. She opened to a clean page and wrote the date. And then she wrote what she was thinking, the way her father had written the calculations for the clay mixtures and the firing temperatures and the cooling schedules, the way you wrote a thing you were working through in order to see it clearly enough to make a decision. She wrote 7 cord remaining, 12 weeks to April. Current burn rate, approximately half a cord per week when the temperature is below 10 degrees. At half a cord per week, 7 cord lasts 14 weeks. April is 12 weeks. She stopped. She read this back. She was not going to run out of wood. She read it again. At the current burn rate, she would have 2 cord remaining in April. She sat with this for a moment. She had believed, since the woodshed counting, that she was going to run out of wood. The belief had arrived with the number 7 and had not been questioned until she wrote the arithmetic down and read it. 2 cord remaining in April was not a disaster. 2 cord remaining in April was adequate. She looked at the fire in the fireplace. She was burning at the rate the fireplace required, the rate of keeping a room warm by burning wood continuously in an inefficient system. She was fine. She was going to be fine. She looked at the stone along the south wall. She was going to be fine at the current burn rate. But the current burn rate was what the current system produced. The current system was an open fireplace with a thin stone back wall and a wide chimney that took most of the heat with it. If the current system was what she had, she would finish the winter with 2 cord remaining, and in the spring she would cut wood, and next October she would have 12 cord again and nothing would change. She wrote, "But what if the system were different?" She wrote this, and then held the pencil over the page for a moment. She wrote, "What if the fire's heat did not go up the chimney? What if it went into the stone first?" She wrote, "The kiln does not lose its heat up a chimney. The kiln's walls absorb the heat. The pottery cools at the rate of the stone, not the rate of the air." She wrote, "If the stone were between the fire and the room, what would change?" She sat with this for a long time. The neighbors, who would later try to describe what Vera Blushkova did in January of 1865, would say different things depending on how much they had understood when she explained it to them. Anna Sabotka, who was her nearest neighbor and her closest friend in Iowa, and who understood practical things with the directness of a woman who had been solving practical problems since she was 12, would say, "She built a stone shelf in front of her fireplace that was so heavy you needed 3 men to move it, and the shelf got hot from the fire and stayed hot all night, and she burned half the wood." That was what Anna said. Gideon Marsh, who owned the adjacent claim to the east and who had a different kind of interest in Vera Blushkova's survival than Anna Sabotka did, would say, "She built some contraption out of field stone and claimed it kept her warm." He would say this with the tone of a man who had been proved wrong about something and had decided that being proved wrong about it did not require him to understand it. What Vera did in January of 1865 was this. She carried the field stones from the south wall to the fireplace, 2 stones at a time, which was the maximum weight she could manage without a cart, and she stacked them on the hearth apron and against the side walls of the fireplace, opening in the configuration she had worked out in the notebook over the course of 2 January afternoons. The configuration was a shelf. Specifically, a shelf of dense grey limestone extending from the fireplace's left cheek wall to the right, at a height of 18 inches above the hearth floor, supported by 2 courses of smaller stone underneath and projecting 8 inches into the room, beyond the fireplace opening. The shelf was 8 inches thick and 24 inches deep from front to back and ran the full 30-inch width of the fireplace opening. She built it without mortar in the first week because she was not certain about the dimensions and she wanted to be able to change them. She fit the stones the way her father fit pieces of clay for the kiln lining, by hand and by eye, the stones that met flush staying where they were placed, and the stones that rocked being shimmed with chips she cut from the softer sandstone she had no other use for. The first fire with the shelf in place was on January 9th. She built the fire below the shelf, which was where the fire went when the shelf was in place, in the reduced firebox below the overhang of stone. The fire was smaller than her normal fire because the shelf reduced the available firebox space by half. She was not certain whether this was a problem. She watched the fire for 30 minutes. The fire burned. The smoke found the upper half of the fireplace opening and went up the chimney the way smoke went up chimneys. The stone shelf above the fire began to change color slightly, the grey going darker, which was heat entering the stone. She put her hand near the shelf's underside, not touching, feeling the radiant heat coming off the limestone. She pressed her hand to the top surface of the shelf, warm. She pressed harder, hot. She held it for a count of 3 before the temperature made her pull her hand back. She had been burning the fire for 30 minutes, and the top of the shelf was already hot to the touch. She wrote in the notebook, January 9th, Fire burning 30 minutes below shelf. Top surface, too hot to hold. Bottom surface, radiating strongly. Stone is absorbing heat rapidly. Room temperature 54 degrees, previous normal at 30 minutes, 49 degrees. Gaining faster. She burned the fire for 2 hours. In those 2 hours, the shelf surface temperature went, by her estimate, to somewhere above 150 degrees, which she determined by the specific manner in which things happened when she touched it briefly. Not a slow burn, but an immediate one. The room temperature reached 61 degrees, which was 5 degrees warmer than her normal 2-hour fire produced. At 2 hours, she let the fire die to coals. She went to the woodpile. She had used approximately a quarter of what a normal 2-hour fire used, because the reduced firebox below the shelf restricted the fire's size, and the restricted fire burned the wood more slowly. Quarter of her normal rate for the same 2 hours. She sat in the hickory chair across the room from the fireplace and waited. The coals faded. By 4 in the afternoon, the fire was out. She watched the room temperature. At 5, 60 degrees. At 6, 59 degrees. At 7, 58. She put the pencil down and pressed her palm to the surface of the shelf. 140 degrees, by her estimate. Still too hot to hold for more than a count of 2. She wrote, January 9th, fire out at 4 p.m. Room temperature at 7 p.m. 3 hours after fire out, 58 degrees. Shelf surface at 7 p.m., approximately 140 degrees. This is not normal. Normal at 7 p.m. after a fire out at 4 is 44 degrees at most. She underlined at most. She wrote, the stone is giving back what it took. She wrote this twice because she wanted to look at it twice. She did not rebuild the fire that night. She sat in the hickory chair and read the almanac by lamplight, and at 9 the room was 55 degrees, and at 10 it was 53, and at 11 she went to bed, and the room was 51 degrees with no fire since 4 in the afternoon. In a normal night without a fire, the room was 38 by 11 o'clock. The difference between 38 and 51 was not a comfortable difference. 51 was cold, but survivable. 38 was the temperature at which you wore your coat to bed and woke cold before dawn and could not sleep again without building a fire. She had been waking before dawn and building a fire since October. She had assumed this was what winter mornings required. She woke the next morning at 6. She pressed her hand to the shelf. 112 degrees. The fire had been out for 14 hours. She pressed her hand to the stone for a full count of 8 before the heat made her pull away. She said, aloud to the empty cabin, 14 hours. She said it in Moravian Czech, the way she said the important things when she was alone, the language that contained all of her childhood and all of her father's kiln and all of the winters in Biskupki, when the village heaters had done exactly this, given back through the night what they had been given during the day, and the families had woken not to a cold room, but to a room that was still warm from yesterday's fire. She had built that in Iowa, with field stone from the creek bed and no mortar and 5 days of figuring. She built the morning fire and wrote in the notebook while the shelf charged. She wrote, what is wrong with the current design? She was not celebrating, she was solving. She wrote, the shelf projects 8 inches into the room. More projection would mean more radiating surface area. If the shelf projected 16 inches, the top surface would have twice the area giving off heat, and the stone would cool more slowly because a larger mass cools more slowly. But a shelf projecting 16 inches would extend into the room and would be in the way and would be a surface she burned herself on. She wrote, what if the shelf were on both sides, left cheek and right cheek projecting inward and meeting at the center? Then the firebox is fully enclosed on top, like a kiln. Not open at the top, closed. She drew this. She looked at the drawing. She wrote, if the firebox is closed at the top, where does the smoke go? She thought about this for a long time. The smoke had to go somewhere. In the current design, the smoke went up and out through the upper half of the fireplace opening. If the shelf closed the top, the smoke had no path. She drew a gap between the back of the shelf and the fireplace back wall, a passage for the smoke to rise through the back of the shelf rather than through the front. If she left a 4-inch gap between the back edge of the shelf and the back wall of the firebox, the smoke would be forced to travel along the underside of the shelf before rising through the back gap. The smoke would spend more time in contact with the stone. More time in contact with the stone meant more heat deposited in the stone. She wrote, "The smoke should heat the shelf on its way out, not bypass it." She wrote, "My current design lets the smoke bypass the shelf. The smoke goes up through the open front. Only the radiant heat from the fire charges the shelf. If the smoke was forced under the shelf and through the back, both the radiant heat and the smoke's heat would charge the shelf." She wrote, "This is what a kiln does. The gases travel through the kiln, not around it." She put the pencil down. She had been a potter's daughter in Biskupki, and she had grown up watching her father move heat through stone. And she had come to Iowa Territory, and for 3 years she had been using a fireplace that moved heat into the air and up the chimney, and she had not thought until the woodpile was 7 and the winter was long to apply what she had always known to the thing she was looking at every day. She spent 3 days rebuilding the shelf with the back gap. The back gap required her to remove the rear course of stones and replace them with shorter pieces that left a 4-inch passage between the stone and the back wall of the firebox. The passage was invisible from the front. From the front, the shelf looked the same as before, a flat slab of limestone above the fire. The gap was behind the stone, between the stone and the firebox wall, and the smoke that formed below the shelf now had to travel rearward and upward through this passage before reaching the chimney. She built the first fire with the modified design on January 14th. The difference was immediate. The smoke, instead of rising freely through the open upper portion of the fireplace, was deflected rearward by the shelf above and channeled through the 4-inch gap at the back. She watched the pattern of the smoke from the side and saw it moving along the underside of the shelf, horizontal, before turning upward at the rear. The shelf was intercepting it. She put her hand on the top surface of the shelf at 30 minutes. She pulled it away immediately. She wrote, January 14th, modified design with rear gap, shelf surface at 30 minutes, cannot hold hand at all, much hotter than original design at same duration. Smoke channeling through rear gap is visible. Room temperature at 30 minutes, 57 degrees. Original design at 30 minutes, 54 degrees. She burned the fire for 90 minutes instead of 2 hours because the shelf was reaching temperature faster. At 90 minutes, she let the fire die. At 3 hours after the fire, room 63 degrees, shelf surface, approximately 170 degrees. At 6 hours after the fire, room 58 degrees, shelf surface, approximately 150. At midnight, room 54, shelf 128. At 6 in the morning, room 48, shelf 101. She pressed her palm to the shelf for a count of 12 before pulling away. She wrote, 16 hours after fire extinguished. Shelf surface still above 100 degrees. Room 48 degrees, which is 12 degrees warmer than normal no-fire room at 16 hours. She wrote, the gap made the difference. The smoke gave its heat to the stone. The fire charges the stone faster and more completely. She wrote, I need more stone. She wrote this last and underlined it, then put on her coat and went to the creek. She was at the creek for 2 days, the 14th and 15th of January. She carried stone both days, the dense grey limestone from the eastern bank, the stone her husband Joseph had also selected for the garden project, the stone that rang with a clean note when you struck it with the hammer, and that had no visible grain or layering that would cause it to split in the thermal cycling. She carried perhaps 400 pounds over the 2 days, loading the cart and making 3 trips each day. the specific work of a woman who had decided on a thing and was acquiring the material. Anna Sabotka saw her going past on the afternoon of the 15th and came out to the road and said, "Vera, what are you carrying?" She said, "Stone." Anna said, "From the creek?" She said, "Yes." Anna looked at the load in the cart. She said, "Are you building something?" She said, "I am adding to something." Anna said, "The fireplace?" She said, "Yes." Anna was 43, from Bohemia, from a village called Liszów, east of České Budějovice, which was close enough to Biskupki that they had been able to talk about home in a way that neither of them could talk about home with most people in Iowa Territory. She was a practical woman who had built and repaired more things on her claim than most women in the settlement, and who had the specific quality that Vera valued most in a person. She asked questions to understand, not to assess. She said, "Come see it when it is done." Anna said, "I will." Vera spent 3 more days adding stone to the shelf. She added a second course on top of the first, bringing the shelf to 16 inches of total thickness, which was more thermal mass to charge and more thermal mass to give back. She extended the shelf forward by 4 more inches, bringing the projection to 12 inches, which was as far as she could project without making the hearth difficult to use. She added stone to the cheek walls on both sides, building them up by a course each, creating a more enclosed channel for the smoke's rearward travel. The finished shelf was a mass of approximately 600 pounds. She built the first fire with the completed shelf on January 18th. The smoke behavior was correct from the first minute. The shelf deflected it rearward, the rearward gap channeled it upward, the chimney drew it out. No smoke in the room. The shelf surface was at 150 degrees within 20 minutes, which she measured by the longest duration she could hold her palm to it before pain made her pull away. Approximately 4 seconds, which was the 4-second threshold above 150 that she had calibrated through the previous 2 weeks of testing. She burned the fire for 1 hour and 20 minutes. She used 1/4 of a normal day's wood. When the fire was out, the shelf was at approximately 180 degrees. She could not hold her hand on it at all. She wrote, January 18th, completed shelf, full build. Fire, 1 hour 20 minutes. Wood used, 1/4 normal. Shelf surface, cannot hold hand. Room temperature at fire out, 68 degrees. Previous record, 62 at similar fire duration. She wrote, I will not build another fire until tomorrow morning. At midnight, the room was 62 degrees. At 6 in the morning, 56 degrees, the shelf at 98. She had burned 1/4 of a normal day's wood, and the room had been warm for 22 hours. She sat in the hickory chair and did the arithmetic in the notebook with the specific satisfaction of a woman who had been working toward a number for 3 weeks and had arrived at it. Normal system, 1/2 cord per week in deep cold, 7 cord for 12 weeks. Sufficient, but not generously so. Shelf system at 1/4 the normal burn rate, 1/8 of a cord per week. 7 cord for 12 weeks, used 1.5 cord. 5.5 cord remaining in April. She wrote 5.5 cord. She wrote it and read it and read it again. She wrote, I do not need to go to the creek again this winter. What I have is not what I have if I burn it the old way. What I have is more than I need if I burn it the new way. She wrote, Joseph cut 9 cord in October. I cut 3. We have 7 remaining. Together we cut 12 and burned 5 by January. He died in October and I have been burning alone, and there is still 7 cord in January because the shelf changed what burning alone means. She stopped writing. She looked at the shelf. She looked at the fire, which was small and managed and burning under the stone. She thought about Joseph. Józef Blaszka had come from a village called Twarożna in Moravia, 7 miles from her own village, which was close enough that their families had known each other when they were children and far enough that they had not met until they were both 23 and had come to the same market in Brno. He had been a joiner, a maker of fitted wood, a man whose professional habit was the exact fit between surfaces. the joint that held because the wood pressed against itself at every point and had nowhere to shift. He had come to Iowa because a cousin from Tverozhna was in Iowa, and the cousin's letters described land that was good land and flat and available, and he had come with those letters and with Vera, and with the specific confidence of a 38-year-old man who had married well and chosen well, and who had every reason to expect the Iowa land to be what the letters said it was. The Iowa land was what the letters said. Joseph had died of a fever that had nothing to do with the land. She had been 40 years old when he died, and she had 7 cord of wood in January, and a claim that was in her name, because they had filed it jointly, and a jointly filed claim did not revert to the county on the death of one party. Gideon Marsh had told her this, not as information but as a question, the way people told you things they wanted to be different from what they were. He had come in November and said, "I don't know if the joint claim holds up legally when one party is deceased." She had said, "I spoke with the land office in October. The claim holds." He had said, "Well," he had looked at the cabin and the woodpile and the fields. He had said, "If you find yourself needing to sell in the spring." She had said, "I will not need to sell in the spring." He had looked at the woodpile, which was 11 cord in November, and which he could calculate as well as she could. He had said, "It will be a hard winter." She had said, yes. He had left. He would come back. She knew he would come back because Gideon Marsh was a man who saw things he wanted and came back until he got them, or until the thing he wanted was no longer available. He was not malicious. He was the specific kind of not malicious that was more difficult to manage than malicious, the kind where the person's self-interest was so complete that it had absorbed the possibility of seeing someone else's situation as anything other than a problem to be solved in his favor. She did not resent him this. She had grown up watching men like Gideon Marsh, and she understood them precisely. She would not be selling the claim. Anna Sabotka came to see the shelf on January 22nd. She came in and looked at it and said nothing for a moment, which was Anna's way of looking at things seriously. She walked to the fireplace and crouched and looked at the shelf from the side, the profile of it, the 16-inch thickness and the 12-inch projection, and the 2 cheek walls built up on either side. She put her hand on the top surface. She said, "How hot?" Vera said, "The fire has been out for 6 hours, still above 100 degrees. Do not hold your hand." Anna held her hand for approximately 3 seconds and pulled it away. She said, "And the smoke?" Vera said, "Goes through the gap at the back. I will show you." She built a small fire, a fire of kindling and 1 piece of split oak, and they crouched on either side of the fireplace and watched the smoke. Anna could see the deflection immediately, the smoke that formed below the shelf traveling rearward along the underside, rather than rising freely, the horizontal movement before the turn upward through the gap. Anna said, "The shelf sends the smoke to the back." Vera said, "The smoke heats the shelf before it leaves, both from below and through the gases." Anna said, "And the shelf holds it." Vera said, "The shelf holds it for 16 hours. Longer on the coldest nights because the cold pulls it faster." Anna sat back on her heels. She said, "How much wood?" Vera said, 1/4 of what I was using." Anna said, 1/4. Vera said, "1 fire of 1 hour and 20 minutes in the morning. On the coldest days, I add a short evening fire of 40 minutes. That is all." Anna was quiet. She was looking at the shelf with the focused attention of a woman who was calculating what 1/4 meant for her own woodpile, which Vera knew was not generous because Anna's husband, Tomasz, had been ill since November, with a chest complaint that had kept him from cutting, and that had left Anna doing the barn work and the housework and the cutting alone since December, the same as Vera had been doing alone, and Anna's pile was, by Vera's estimate, 9 cord in January. Anna said, 9 cord will last until April. Vera said 9 cord at 1/4 burn will last until the following September. Anna looked at her. Vera said, come tomorrow. I will show you how to build it. The stone is at the creek, the east bank. The dense, grey stone. You need at least 400 pounds for a basic shelf. Anna said, 400 pounds. Vera said, I carried it in 2 days. You know how to carry stone. Anna said, yes. She went home. She came back the next morning, and they went to the creek together and carried stone. The shelf at the Sabotka claim went up in 4 days at the end of January, Vera advising and Anna building, the two of them working in the cold cabin with their coats on, fitting the stone by hand, the way Vera had fit hers, without mortar in the first build, because fitting first and mortaring second was how you found your errors before they were permanent. The inaugural fire at the Sabotka claim was on February 2nd. Anna pressed her hand to the top of the shelf at 45 minutes, held it for 1 second, and pulled it away. She said, it works the same. Vera said, it is the same stone and the same fire. Yes, Anna said, to Marsh. Vera said, where is he? Anna said, in the bed. The chest is better this week. Vera said, bring him out when the room is warm. They built up the fire and the shelf charged, and by 11 in the morning the room was 64 degrees, which was warmer than the Sabotka cabin had been since before Tomasz had gotten ill. Tomasz Sabotka came out of the bed at noon in his coat and sat in the chair near the fireplace and pressed his hand to the warm shelf and said something in Czech that Vera did not fully catch, something about the stone. Anna said, she built it herself. Vera said, my father's kiln. I thought about it in January. Tomasz said, the kiln. She said, the stone absorbs the heat and gives it back slowly. A kiln is a room-sized version of this shelf. She paused. I grew up in a room-sized version. Tomasz looked at the shelf. He was 51, a Bohemian farmer who had come to Iowa in 1858 and who had the chest complaint of a man who had been sleeping in an inadequately heated room since November. He pressed his hand to the shelf surface. He held it. He said, how long has it been since the fire? Anna said, 3 hours. He said, still above 100 degrees. Vera said, yes. He held his hand longer this time, leaning forward in the chair, his palm flat against the warm surface. And something in his posture changed, the posture of a sick man who has been in a cold room long enough that warmth has become a thing he is grateful for rather than a thing he expects. He said, it is different from the stove. Vera said, the stove goes cold when the fire goes cold. The shelf gives back slowly. The warmth is constant. He said, constant. She said, within a few degrees, yes. The stove swings from very hot to cold. The shelf stays between 150 and 100 degrees for 12 hours. The room does not have the cold swings. He paused. For a chest complaint, the cold swings are what set it back. The moment at 2 in the morning when the stove is cold and the room drops to freezing and you breathe in the cold air, that moment undoes what the warm afternoon built. Tomasz looked at his wife. Anna said nothing. She was looking at the shelf. Vera said, the shelf does not go cold at 2 in the morning. He said nothing more. He sat in the chair for the rest of the afternoon and breathed the steady warmth of the Sabotka cabin, which for the first time since November was not the warmth of a fire in progress, but the warmth of stone, remembering a fire that had been, the gentler and more sustained warmth that stone produced when it was doing its work correctly. He was better by the 2nd week of February. Gideon Marsh came on February 17th. He came in the afternoon, which was when visits in February happened, the morning being the time for work, and the afternoon being the time when the cold had been managed, and you could spare the hour for whatever else required attention. He was 49, an American from Ohio, which in Iowa Territory in 1865 meant he had been in the territory longer than most immigrants and had established himself accordingly, with 320 acres of flat black Iowa soil and a frame house and a barn that was by any measure the best barn in the Clearwater Valley. He knocked and came in and stood in the doorway for a moment. He said, "It's warm in here." She said, "Yes." He said, "It's -12 outside." She said, "I know." He looked at the fireplace. He looked at the shelf and the small fire burning below it. He looked at the woodpile, which was against the south wall, and which was, by her count that morning, 5 cord and 3/4. He said, "You have a great deal of wood remaining." She said, "I have changed the way I burn." He said, "Changed how?" She explained the shelf briefly, the way she explained it to everyone who asked. The stone absorbs the fire's heat. The gap channels the smoke under the stone holds the heat for 16 hours. The fire is 1/4 the size and duration of a normal fire. Marsh listened with the specific quality of a man who was listening for the catch. There was always a catch. If a woman alone in January had 5 cord and 3/4 remaining after burning since October, there was a catch somewhere. He said, "How much wood did you start with?" She said, 12 cord. He said, 12. She said, "Joseph cut 9 in October. I cut 3 in November and December." He was quiet. He was doing the arithmetic. He said, "You have burned 6 cord since October." She said, "Yes." He said, "In a winter that has been below 0 more days than not since December." She said, "Yes." He looked at the fire. He looked at the shelf. He said, "How does the smoke get out? The shelf is in the way." She said, "There is a gap at the back of the shelf between the stone and the firebox back wall. The smoke travels under the stone and up through the gap." She paused. "On its way through, it deposits heat in the stone," he said, "and the stone gives it back." She said, "For 16 hours. He looked at the shelf for a long time. He said, "I have 7 cord remaining." She said, "I know." He had started with 14. She knew this because everyone in the Clearwater Valley knew what everyone else had started with, and Gideon Marsh was a man who was not careful about keeping his quantities to himself when the quantities were impressive. He had been burning a standard cast-iron stove, the best stove money in Iowa Territory could acquire, a 6-plate Pennsylvania stove that had cost him $40 and that he had been proud of in September in the way people were proud of things that cost $40, and that were the best available. The best available, in a winter that was below 0 more days than not, was 7 cord remaining in February. He had not come in February to make an offer on the claim. He had come in February because there was no offer to make. The arithmetic of her woodpile had removed the premise of the offer. He had come because he was a practical man, and a practical man who had 7 cord remaining in February, and whose neighbor had nearly 6 cord remaining, came to find out what his neighbor had done differently. She said, "Sit down." He sat down. She got the notebook. She showed him the January entries, the temperature measurements before and after the fire, the shelf temperatures at 6 hours and 12 hours and 16 hours. She showed him the calculations, the burn rate at 1/4 normal, the cord consumption per week. He looked at the numbers with the attention of a man who counted things and who knew what numbers meant. He said, "I could build this in a week." She said, 3 days for the basic shelf. A week if you want the full build, with the double course on top. He said, "The gap at the back, that is the key." She said, "The gap channels the smoke under the stone. Without the gap, the stone gets only the radiant heat from the fire. With the gap, it gets the smoke heat as well." She paused. "The smoke is hot. Before my shelf, the smoke took that heat up the chimney. Now the stone takes it first." He said, "And you built this in January, without a mason." She said, "I grew up watching my father build kilns. The principle is the same." She paused. "The kiln does not waste heat up a chimney. The kiln moves heat through stone." He said, "Your father was a potter." She said, "In Biskupki." "Yes." He said, "In Moravia." She said, "Yes." He was quiet. He said the stone from the East Creek bank. She said the dense grey, not the sandstone from the North bank. The sandstone cracks in the thermal cycling after 2 or 3 seasons. The grey limestone from the East bank will outlast the cabin it sits in. He said, how much do you need? She said, for a shelf the size of mine, 400 to 500 pounds. For a double course, 600. He said, I can carry that in a day. She said, in 2 days if you want to do it without risk to your back. He said, after a moment, yes, 2 days. She showed him the drawings in the notebook, the measurements, the gap dimensions, the angle of the cheek wall extensions. He studied the drawings with the attention he gave to the yield tables for his south field and the price lists at the Clearwater trading post. The careful attention of a man who used numbers to make decisions and who understood that the quality of the numbers was the quality of the decisions. He left in the late afternoon. She watched him go from the window, the figure crossing the frozen field toward the better barn and the Pennsylvania stove that had burned 7 cord of his 14 since October. She did not feel satisfaction about this. She felt what she felt about the shelf, which was the satisfaction of a thing built correctly. Gideon Marsh was going to build a shelf and use less wood, and she had explained it to him and he had listened, and this was an adequate outcome, regardless of what he had intended to accomplish by coming to her door. He had come for a reason that was no longer relevant, and he was leaving with information that was useful. This was better than the alternative. She went back to the notebook. She wrote, February 17th, Marsh came, explained the shelf. He will build. Showed him East Creek stone and gap dimensions. He understood the principle in one conversation. She wrote, the principle is not complicated, it is only unfamiliar. She wrote, unfamiliar and complicated are different things, and the settlement treats them as the same. She wrote this, and then looked at it and thought it was probably true beyond the stone shelf and the wood pile, and she would have said so to Joseph, who would have laughed in his specific way, the quiet laugh of a man who found things funny without needing to announce that he found them funny. She closed the notebook. March came with the specific exhaustion of a winter that has lasted long enough and that is no longer cold enough to be serious, but is still cold enough to require attention. The fires were shorter in March, the shelf needing less charging because the March air outside was not pulling the heat out of the room as aggressively as January had. She was burning 40 minutes some mornings and none at all on the afternoons when the March sun came through the south window and put its own heat into the stone. The March sun on the south window. She had not thought about the south window until March showed her. The south window was 4 feet wide and admitted the low March sun in the afternoons, and the low March sun on the south wall was, by her palm on the wall, approximately 70 degrees. The wall was warm. The wall was frame construction with no thermal mass, and the warmth was already dissipating through the siding, already losing itself in the Iowa March air before it could do any sustained work. If the wall had been stone. She wrote in the notebook, March sun on south wall. Wall is frame, no mass. Heat lost immediately. If I build a stone facing on the south wall interior, even 2 courses, perhaps 2 feet high, the March sun would charge the stone in the afternoon and the stone would give back in the evening. She wrote, there is more to learn here. She wrote this last and underlined it, the way she underlined the things that were not finished, but were pointed toward something she could not yet fully see. April came, and the winter was over. She counted the woodpile on the 1st of April, 4 cord and a quarter. She had started with 12, and she had burned 7 3/4 in the worst Iowa winter since the settlement had been keeping records, a winter that was below zero from the 16th of December to the 20th of February, with 3 brief exceptions, a winter that had pressed every woodpile in the Clearwater Valley and had found the ones that were adequate and the ones that were not. She had 4 cord and a quarter remaining. Anna Sabotka had 3 cord remaining, down from 9 in January, the chest complaint warmth of the Sabotka cabin having consumed more than Vera's single-occupant burn rate, but still vastly less than a standard stove would have consumed. Tomasz Sabotka, sleeping on the warm shelf on the coldest nights, and waking well instead of worse. Gideon Marsh had built his shelf in late February, 3 weeks before the cold broke, and had burned 1 cord between the shelf's completion and April. He had 4 cord remaining from his original 14, which was 4 more than the arithmetic of his stove rate would have given him. He came in April to tell her this. He came on a Tuesday morning when the mud was managing itself in the Iowa spring way, present everywhere and inconvenient but no longer the deep problem of the wet months ahead, and he knocked and came in and said, 4 cord. She said, from 14. He said, I burned 10 cord before the shelf and 1 cord after. He paused. 6 weeks of February and March. She said, the late build costs more than the early build. You lost 3 weeks of January to the stove. He said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, if I had built it in October. She said, 3 cord for the winter, perhaps 3.5. He was quiet again. She said, build it properly this summer. Mortar the joints this time. The unmortared joints are adequate for 1 winter, but the thermal cycling will shift the stones by the 2nd year, and the gap dimensions will change, and the performance will degrade. She paused. Lime mortar, not mud. The lime sets hard and allows a small amount of movement without cracking. He said, you have mortared yours. She said, in March, when the cold broke enough for the mortar to cure. Yes. He said, how long does it take to cure? She said, 7 days above freezing. After 7 days it is set, he said, and the lime. She said, the Clearwater trading post. Ask for hydraulic lime, not agricultural lime. The hydraulic lime sets hard in humid conditions. Agricultural lime will wash out in the first wet season. He was writing things in a small book he had taken from his coat pocket. She watched him write. He wrote the way she wrote, the way people who used numbers wrote, carefully and precisely, the word and its specification together, so that the specification could not be separated from the word and confused with a similar but different thing. He said, hydraulic lime. She said, yes. He closed the small book. He said, I will send my son to you in June with questions. She said, send him. He paused at the door. He said, your husband cut the wood. She said, the first 9 cord. Yes. He said, and you cut 3 more. She said, in November, after. He said, alone. She said, the crosscut saw is built for 2. I learned to use it alone. He said, what is the difference? She said, you brace the near end with your knee on the downstroke instead of with a second person's pull. It is slower. She paused. It is slower and it works. He said nothing for a moment. He said, the shelf. She said, yes. He said, I will tell people about it. This summer at the gathering. She said, tell them the gap. Tell them the gap is the part that matters. Without the gap, the stone only gets the radiant heat. With the gap, the stone gets the smoke heat as well. Tell them that. He said, the gap. She said, yes. He left. She went back inside and pressed her palm to the shelf, the April shelf, the shelf she had built in 3 January days from Creekstone, and the knowledge her father had given her by working his kiln in front of her through her entire childhood, the knowledge she had not thought to apply to the fireplace until the woodpile was 7 and the winter was long and the hickory chair was cold, and she sat in it, looking at the thing she looked at every day and saw it differently. The shelf was at 78 degrees. The sun was coming through the south window. She pressed her hand to the surface and held it. She thought about her father in Biskupki, bent over the kiln in the posture of a man doing the work his trade required, the knowledge in his hands and in his posture, and in the particular way he listened to a kiln, the way you listened to anything that was telling you something you needed to hear. He had been dead for 6 years. Dead in Moravia while she was building a life in Iowa with Joseph, dead of a winter fever, the way the old died in Moravia when the cold was serious enough. He had built his last kiln the year before he died. His last kiln was still firing in Biskupki. Her cousin had written to say so. She had built her first shelf in Iowa. She thought, the kiln outlasts the potter. She pressed her palm to the warm stone of the shelf. She thought, the shelf will be here when I am not. She thought about whoever came next, the woman or man who would live in this cabin after her, who would find a stone shelf in front of the fireplace and would not know what it was or why it was there, and would learn it the way you learned things that had been left by people who knew how to build, by using it, by pressing their hand to the warm surface in January at 6 in the morning after no fire since yesterday, by finding the 112 degrees that the stone had been keeping. For them, through the night, they would not need to know her name. They would need the gap. She pressed her palm to the 78-degree shelf in April and thought, remember the gap. She closed her eyes. The shelf was warm under her hand. Outside, the Iowa spring was doing what it did, the mud and the birds and the creek running clear again, and the fields coming back to the color of something about to be useful. And the stone she was touching had been in the creek bank until January, and would be in this fireplace long past anything she could project or plan for, holding heat in the way stone held everything, without urgency, without complaint, for as long as the fire kept coming. She opened her eyes. She wrote, April 1st. 4 cord remaining. South window, hydraulic lime, remember the gap. She closed the notebook. She went to the creek.